The first report. In November 1971, a family in Old Bowie, Maryland reported an incident they could not explain. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the Edwards family let their dog outside. Within minutes, it was gone. There was no barking, no signs of a struggle, and no tracks leading in or out of the yard. According to April Edwards, the yard appeared completely undisturbed, no damage to the fence, no visible entry point, and no indication that anything had forced its way in or out. Predators common to the region, such as foxes or coyotes, typically leave some form of trace, tracks on disturbed ground, noise. In this case, none were identified. No official cause was determined, which raises a simple question. How did something enter and leave without being heard? Context and location. The incident occurred near Fletchertown Road, a rural stretch in Prince George's County, Maryland. The road runs through dense woodland with limited street lighting and low nighttime traffic. In the early 1970s, the area was less developed than it is today, increasing isolation after dark. At the time, the 1971 report was treated as an isolated case, a missing animal with unusual circumstances. However, subsequent accounts collected through local testimonies, community reports, and later folklore documentation suggested similar experiences in the same area. That assumption would not hold for long. Reconstruction of the 1971 incident. If the timeline of the 1971 report is examined step by step, several details become more difficult to reconcile. The dog is let outside. The time is approximately 9:30 p.m. The yard is enclosed. There are no reported gaps in the fence, no prior disturbances. Within the first minute, nothing appears unusual. No barking, no sudden movement, no indication that anything has entered the yard. The environment remains still. By the second minute, the absence of sound becomes more noticeable. Dogs typically react to unfamiliar presence. Even small disturbances, movement, scent, or sound can trigger a response. In this case, none was reported, which suggests either no perceived threat or something that did not trigger a normal response. By the third minute, the dog is no longer visible. No transition is observed, no sequence of movement leading to disappearance, no interruption in the environment. If an animal entered the yard, it would need to do so without creating noise. Move across the space without being detected. Locate the dog immediately, and remove it within a limited window of time. At the same time, it would need to leave without disturbing the ground, damaging the fence, or leaving a visible path of exit. This introduces a compressed sequence of actions that typically produce evidence: tracks, sound, disturbance. In this case, none were reported, which creates a gap in the expected sequence, not just in what happened, but in how it could have happened without leaving trace. If reconstructed logically, the event requires multiple conditions to occur simultaneously, each individually possible but collectively unlikely. Which leads back to the central problem, not that the event occurred, but that the process itself does not align with known patterns. Environmental analysis. To understand the conditions of these reports, the environment itself must be considered. Fletchertown Road is surrounded by dense woodland. At night, light sources are minimal. Headlights provide narrow visibility. Peripheral vision is limited. In such environments, depth perception is reduced. Shapes appear distorted, movement is harder to track. However, these same conditions apply consistently, which would normally produce varied interpretations, different shapes, different behaviors, different descriptions. Instead, reports remain structurally similar, which raises a contradiction. If the environment is influencing perception, why is the outcome so consistent? Another factor is sound behavior. Wooded areas amplify certain noises while dampening others. Even small animals typically produce audible movement. Leaves and branches, ground disturbance. The repeated absence of sound is not impossible, but it is uncommon enough to be noted across multiple accounts. This creates a second layer of inconsistency, not just visual but environmental, which raises a broader question. If both sight and sound behave differently in these reports, is the explanation environmental or something interacting within that environment in an unexpected way? Human perception and misidentification. Another explanation involves how the human brain processes incomplete information. In low visibility, the brain attempts to complete patterns, filling gaps, interpreting shapes. This can result in misidentification, objects appearing larger than they are, movement seeming intentional when it is not, stillness being interpreted as awareness. However, perception errors typically vary between individuals. Different people interpret the same stimulus differently. In these reports, variation exists, but the structure remains consistent. A figure upright near the tree line, observed briefly. This consistency does not eliminate misidentification as a factor, but it complicates it, because it suggests that either similar conditions are producing similar interpretations, or something consistent is being observed. Neither conclusion is definitive, but both leave the same question unresolved. What exactly is being perceived in these moments? If the timeline of the 1971 report is examined step by step, several details become more difficult to reconcile. The dog is let outside. The time is approximately 9:30 p.m. The yard is enclosed. There are no reported gaps in the fence, no prior disturbances. Within the first minute, nothing appears unusual, no barking, no sudden movement, no indication that anything has entered the yard. By the second minute, the absence of sound becomes more noticeable. Dogs typically react to unfamiliar presence. Even small disturbances, movement, scent, or sound can trigger a response. In this case, none was reported. By the third minute, the dog is no longer visible. No transition is observed, no sequence of movement leading to disappearance. If an animal entered the yard, it would need to do so without creating noise, move across the space without being detected, locate the dog immediately, and remove it within a limited window of time. At the same time, it would need to leave without disturbing the ground, damaging the fence, or leaving a visible path of exit. That sequence is not impossible, but it introduces multiple points where some form of evidence would typically appear. Tracks sound disruption. In this case, none were reported, which creates a gap in the expected sequence, not just in what happened, but in how it could have happened without leaving trace. Which leads back to the central problem. Not that the event occurred, but that the process itself does not align with known patterns. Late night passenger account, 1973 approximate. Around 1973, two individuals traveling along Fletchertown Road late at night reported a similar observation. The vehicle was moving at a moderate speed with no other traffic present. According to the account, a figure appeared briefly along the right side of the road. The passenger noticed it first, describing it as standing partially within the tree line, not fully visible, but upright. The driver slowed. The figure did not move away, which did not match expected animal behavior. As the headlights passed over the area, the figure appeared to shift slightly, not retreating but adjusting position. The passenger later stated that the movement did not resemble a deer or known wildlife. No sound was reported and no impact occurred. When the vehicle passed, the figure was no longer visible. The account was later shared informally within the local community. At the time, it was treated as a single, unexplained observation, but it introduced the same elements seen in earlier reports. A figure, partially visible, not reacting as expected. Jacuzzi Bridge area encounter, late 1970s reported. Several reports from the late 1970s reference encounters near bridge structures along or near Fletchertown Road. In one account, a driver slowed near a narrow crossing. Visibility was limited due to tree cover and lack of lighting. According to the report, a shape was observed near the edge of the structure, stationary, upright, not immediately identifiable. The driver did not stop. As the vehicle passed, no movement toward the road was observed. No sound was reported. The figure remained in position, only partially visible in the headlights. After passing the location, the driver did not observe anything in the rear view mirror. The account was later grouped with similar reports involving limited visibility and stationary figures. Cause A. Repeated observation pattern, 1980s community reports. Through the 1980s, informal community reports continued to describe similar experiences, often involving brief sightings near wooded areas, upright figures near road edges, lack of sound during movement. In several accounts, witnesses describe the same sequence. A figure becomes visible, remains present, then disappears without a clear path of movement. In some cases, witnesses reported feeling observed before identifying any visual detail, which introduces a pattern not limited to sight but perception. Primary encounter. Reported case unnamed driver, winter 1971 to 1972. Winter 1971 to 1972, shortly after midnight. A driver traveling alone along Fletchertown Road reported an encounter that would later be referenced in multiple regional summaries. The conditions were typical for the area: low visibility, no street lighting, dense tree cover on both sides of the road. The driver described approaching a gradual bend when something became visible near the edge of the tree line. At first, it appeared to be an animal, stationary, partially within shadow. The driver reduced speed slightly, not out of concern, but to better identify what was being seen. As the headlights reached the figure, several details became clearer. The posture appeared upright, not angled like a deer, not low to the ground. The height was difficult to determine precisely, but was described as higher than expected for known animals in the area. The outline remained unclear. The head shape could not be fully distinguished, but it did not match a typical animal profile. At this point, the driver expected movement. Animals typically react to approaching vehicles, either retreating or crossing the road. In this case, neither occurred. The figure remained in position, then moved. Not quickly, not erratically. It shifted slightly forward, into the edge of the headlights. The movement was described as controlled, deliberate, not reactive. The driver did not stop, instead continued forward and past the location. As the vehicle moved beyond the figure, the driver checked the rearview mirror. Nothing was visible. No movement in the road, no shape in the headlights behind, no indication of where the figure had gone. No sound was reported during the entire encounter. No brush movement and no footsteps, no impact. The driver later stated that the most unusual aspect was not the appearance, but the behavior, the lack of reaction, the absence of sound, and the way the figure remained present just long enough to be observed before no longer being there. This account was not widely documented at the time. It was shared informally and later included in regional collections of similar reports. Individually, it could be dismissed. Low visibility, misinterpretation. But when compared to other accounts, the details align. A figure near the road, partially visible, and not behaving in a way that matches expected patterns, which raises a more specific question. If the figure was aware of the vehicle, why did it not respond in a typical way? Secondary driver account. Winter 1971 to 1972, date unspecified, shortly after midnight. A driver traveling along Fletchertown Road reported an unusual observation while returning home. Road conditions were typical: minimal lighting, dense tree cover, and little to no traffic. According to the account, the driver noticed a shape near the edge of the tree line as the vehicle approached a bend, initially assumed to be a deer. However, the figure did not move as expected. It remained still as the headlights passed over it, not frozen, but stationary in a way that did not match typical animal behavior. The driver slowed slightly. The outline was partially obscured by shadow. As the vehicle moved forward, the figure shifted position. Not abruptly, not in retreat. It stepped slightly further into the edge of the light. The movement was described as controlled and deliberate. No attempt to cross the road, no immediate retreat. After passing the location, the driver checked the rear-view mirror. The figure was no longer visible. No sound was reported, no indication of where it had gone, which raises another question. If the figure was aware of the vehicle, why did it not respond in a typical way? What doesn't add up? Following the initial reports, several elements were examined against known causes. Wildlife behavior was the first comparison. In Prince George's County, typical predators include foxes and coyotes. These animals are known to leave indicators, tracks, disturbed soil, audible movement. In the 1971 account, none of these were identified. No clear tracks despite ground conditions that would typically retain impressions, no fence damage, no reported noise, which does not align with standard predatory patterns. Timing is another factor. The interval between release and disappearance was described as only a few minutes. Within that window, an unknown agent would need to enter the yard, locate the animal, remove it, exit the area without being heard, and without leaving visible evidence. While not impossible, this sequence is difficult to reconcile with known behavior. The driver's account presents a separate inconsistency. Animals typically react to headlights by freezing briefly or fleeing. In this case, the figure remained and then shifted slightly into the light. A controlled adjustment rather than a reactive movement, which raises a question about intent. Across multiple reports, the absence of sound is noted. In wooded environments, even small animals generate noise when moving through brush. The lack of audible disturbance is unusual enough to be consistently reported. Individually, these details can be explained. Collectively, they do not align with expected patterns, which leads to a more direct question. Are these incidents being misinterpreted, or do they point to something not yet identified? The pattern that emerges as additional accounts were compiled 1970s to 1990s based on local testimonies and later folklore collections. Recurring elements appeared. Location: Fletchertown Road and adjacent wooded areas. Time: late evening to early morning, typically after 10 p.m. Conditions: low visibility, limited traffic. Descriptions were not identical, but shared structure. A figure near the tree line, partially visible. Upright posture, movement described as controlled. Behavioral pattern: lack of flight response, brief visibility, no clear departure path. Sound reports varied, but when present were described as unfamiliar, not clearly animal or human. Individually, each report could be attributed to conditions or perception. Collectively, the consistency introduces a different problem. Independent accounts describing similar features over time, which shifts the question from what was seen to why descriptions remain consistent across witnesses and years. Possible explanations. Several explanations have been proposed based on available reports and environmental factors. Misidentification remains the most common. Low light can distort size and shape. Animals such as deer can appear atypical when partially illuminated. However, this does not fully account for repeated descriptions of controlled movement or lack of sound. Environmental factors may influence perception. Isolation and reduced visibility can alter interpretation of unclear stimuli. If this were the primary cause, greater variation between reports would be expected. Instead, certain details remain consistent. Folklore influence is another possibility. Once a narrative exists, later reports may align with it. However, some early accounts appear to predate widespread awareness of the legend in its current form. An unidentified animal has also been suggested. This would explain physical presence, but not the consistent absence of tracks or sound. Each explanation accounts for part of the pattern, none account for all of it, which leaves the situation unresolved. Historical parallels and cultural context. Comparisons have been made between modern reports and older cultural descriptions. In ancient Greek sources, satyrs were described as part human and part animal, often associated with wooded environments and remote areas. These figures were not considered creatures in the modern sense, but representations tied to nature and isolation. Roman accounts of fauns describe similar forms, again tied to forests, movement at the edges of human spaces, and encounters that were not always clearly understood. Across multiple cultures, similar descriptions appear, figures that are partially human, partially animal, observed briefly, and rarely fully visible. In some traditions, these are connected to shape-shifting concepts, entities described as not having a fixed form, appearing differently depending on conditions or perception. These accounts vary widely in meaning. They are often tied to cultural belief systems rather than direct observation. However, the structural similarity remains: an upright figure near wooded areas, partially visible, and difficult to identify clearly. In North American traditions, there are also references to entities associated with forests and shifting forms. Some Native American oral histories describe beings that do not present consistently, not fully human, not fully animal, and not always understood in physical terms. These accounts are not uniform, and interpretations vary by tribe and region. They are not direct explanations for modern reports, but they introduce another layer to the pattern, which leads to a broader question. If descriptions of similar figures appear across different cultures, separated by geography and time, are these accounts the result of similar environmental conditions influencing perception? Or do they reflect a repeated type of observation that has never been clearly identified? Historical development of the Goatman legend. The term Goatman itself does not appear in early records. It is a later label applied as reports became more widely discussed. In Maryland, references to unusual sightings along Fletchertown Road began appearing informally in the early 1970s, initially treated as isolated incidents, but over time, as accounts accumulated, the descriptions began to align. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, local storytelling began to attach a name to the pattern, a figure, part human, part animal, observed near wooded roads. As the label spread, it began to influence how new reports were described, which introduces a complication. Later accounts may reflect both observation and expectation, making it more difficult to separate original details from interpreted ones. Despite this, certain elements appear consistently even in earlier reports. upright posture, partial visibility, lack of sound, controlled movement. These details were present before the legend was widely established, which suggests that the pattern may not be entirely the result of storytelling. At that point, the question shifts again, not just what people are seeing, but how the interpretation of those sightings has changed over time, and whether the label itself has influenced the way the phenomenon is understood, which leaves a final consideration. If the description came first and the name came later, what exactly were those early witnesses trying to describe? Conclusion: what remains unresolved? Across multiple decades, the reports follow a consistent structure, a location, a time frame, and a type of observation that does not fully align with known explanations. Individually, each account can be questioned, visibility conditions, memory, interpretation, but taken together, the pattern becomes more difficult to dismiss. Independent witnesses, similar descriptions, repeated under different conditions. No physical evidence has been confirmed, no species has been identified, and no single explanation accounts for all reported details. What remains is a series of observations, brief, inconsistent in clarity, but consistent in structure. A figure near wooded roads, partially visible, and behaving in a way that does not match expected patterns. Over time, the name changed how these reports were understood, but the descriptions themselves appeared before the label, which suggests that something was being observed before it was defined. To this day, no confirmed explanation has been established. No conclusion has resolved the pattern, and no identification has been universally accepted, which leaves a final question. If multiple people across different years reported seeing something similar in the same type of place under similar conditions, what exactly were they observing? And why has it never been clearly identified? More cases like this are still being reported.